today we're going to be talking about getting better at talking about pleasure, because it's a lot, isn't it? You know, it's just a lot. And we live in Elle's just joined. So Elle, you need to send me a request, my love. And I think that's down the bottom. See, I'm on an Android and she's on, oh, here we go. She's on an iPhone. Let her in. It's still very new and exciting.
Here we go.
Here we go. Look at this.
God. Sorry about that.
We were just warming the people up,
Yes.
talking about how difficult it is to talk about pleasure, and that's why we picked this subject for this session today. Yeah. I feel like I'm very close. Am I very close? Are we a bit too close for comfort?
It's all right.
I'm just going to turn you up, and you can turn me on. Oh, listen to that.
Very sexy, darling.
Very sexy, darling. So we're all here. You're here, I'm here.
I'm here, and
it's Friday in America. It's Saturday in Australia.
It's very true. So we picked communication, and you guys went. We got so many questions.
A bazillion.
Bazillion questions.
Bazillion, an actual number like this long.
Yeah, this long. So we're not going to be able to get them all, but we'll get to some. And for those of you that don't know, my dear wife Cindy, she is an internationally recognized sexuality and relationship expert and clinical sexologist with a proven record as a go-to expert in modern sexuality, in not just the US or the UK, but also in her native Australia. She's living in New York now, but in Australia, she is considered the preeminent authority on all things sex and relationships. She's trained as a counselor, a narrative therapist, and is published in many journals and all over the media. So that is who Cindy Darnell is. She's
I've gotten around over the years.
You have,
and now I'm in New York. Now I'm in New York City.
New York. New York is now.
And I love it, and I'm going to stay here. Well, for the foreseeable future anyway. So
yes. So the topic we put out there was, what topics around sex do you struggle to communicate to a partner? Like we said, we got a lot. And so I'm going to pick one just off the top of the pile here.
Yeah.
Just something general that I think everybody has a problem with, which is communicating when you're in the moment and something hurts or doesn't feel good, but the other person's really into it. How do you say something in that moment that won't necessarily kill the mood, but is going to be like, instead of like, whoa, that's painful, or I don't enjoy that.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. And I think the answer to that question stems actually way before you start getting it on.
Right.
Because even though the pain is happening in the moment, having, so there's, various contexts, I guess, that this would occur in. If you're in a context with an established partner, someone you already have a rapport with, or somebody that you're having a fling with, or a hookup with.
Right.
So what I would say is, if it's a hookup, if it's hurting you, just say it anyway. Just don't, just say, stop doing that or whatever. Like, just, jump straight in and you can negotiate the feeling part later. If it's a long-term relationship or some sort of an ongoing relationship, ultimately that still remains true. But what you have as leverage in a relationship that's a bit longer is you can talk about in advance. Sometimes I like to sort of give instruction in the middle of it, or I like to talk about what's happening in the middle of it. I'm curious about how you feel about that. How do you feel about me, speaking during sex, and actually having a conversation about pleasure, not just pain. So, because when we start sort of defaulting I can only talk about sex when I'm in pain, right? That sets up a vibe. That's the clinical word, right? It sets up the vibe, It sets up a vibe that we only talk about sex when something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So what I like to encourage people to do is start getting into a practice of talking about sex, not only when something is wrong, because that's important, but
Mm-hmm.
when something is right, when something is good, and
Mm-hmm.
even more, getting into a habit, getting into a practice of starting to talk about sex when you're not in the middle of doing it, when you're not even horny.
Mm-hmm. And
And you
impossible.
start,
Yeah.
yeah, you start talking about sex as, you know, as you would talk about, you know, gardening or what's for dinner or,
Right.
you know, the weather.
Right.
So, I mean, what do you think about that?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say is that it's important to normalize talking about it. And the way to normalize talking about it is to make it an enjoyable conversation. You know,
Yeah,
telling your partner what you really loved about the last time you had sex or what
yeah,
you'd like to do with them.
yeah.
You know, this brings up another question that we got, which was something similar to, listen, I haven't had sex with my partner in years.
Mm.
And every time I bring it up, it triggers them. They get really sort of, you know, I think they said disgusted.
Mm.
So what do I do?
Yeah,
So it's, you know, I think what's out of my purview as a sex educator, which would be in your purview as a sex therapist, is you can talk about pleasure all you want, but how do you communicate with somebody who is obviously has a reaction around
yeah.
sex to at
Mm.
least get the conversation going in some
Mm.
direction?
Yeah,
Yeah, they haven't had sex in years. I don't know if
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So that's, I mean, when sex is a taboo issue
Mm-hmm.
for discussion in
Mm-hmm.
relationships,
Mm-hmm.
we have a different problem. It ceases to be just a sex problem and it
Mm-hmm.
starts to be, it's a power problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because when one person says this topic is forbidden and I'm going to control that by
Mm-hmm.
shutting down the gates,
Mm-hmm.
then it leaves the other person powerless.
Mm-hmm.
And this, you know, this thing makes people uncomfortable when we're looking at it. This is when then we're no longer talking about sex or then we're no longer talking about pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about power.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a much more complicated, nuanced thing because often then there's other stuff going on underneath. So
Mm-hmm.
it can be helpful to recognize that if you're communicating well about most other things, but it's only sex that
Mm-hmm.
is awkward, then possibly it's something that you can sort of discuss and say, so what is it about sex that you find hard to talk about? What happens to you when you start talking about sex? And even just starting at that somatic level, what happens when we talk about sex? Do, you know, your heart rate increases, you get tension,
Mm-hmm.
you know, your hands squeeze up, or do I start telling myself stories that, well, if we start talking about sex, then you're going to want to try and have sex with me, and I've told you I don't want to have sex, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so then we need to start getting at, well, you know, I don't want to have sex. Okay. What kind of sex? Do you mean intercourse, vaginal, anal, oral, whatever? Do you mean I don't want to kiss and cuddle? Do you mean get your hands off me? I don't want to even touch you. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there are so many gradients because to say I don't like sex is like saying I don't like movies.
Right.
You know, it's like there's so many kinds, you know.
Right.
And so when someone says I don't like sex, I'm like, I don't know that I buy
Mm,
that. You know,
yeah.
there are some things that you do like, you know, you maybe like holding hands or whatever. So
Right.
there's grades of that.
Right.
And so somebody who says I don't want to talk about sex is they're like saying I don't want to talk about movies.
Right.
You know, but the difference between sex and movies
Mm-hmm.
is sex is very heavily stigmatized
Mm-hmm.
and that makes people feel uncomfortable. So there's feelings that
Yeah.
sit underneath that. Whereas movies, not so stigmatized. If you
Right.
say, I don't like movies, which I think there's probably not many people on the planet who would say that they don't like movies, but it's not stigmatized. People would just go, strange,
Mm-hmm.
and it wouldn't necessarily affect the outcome of a long-term relationship. If one person doesn't like movies and the other one does, it'll be like, all right, well, I'll watch movies with my friends.
Right.
Whereas, especially in monogamous relationships,
Mm-hmm.
if you're with a partner who doesn't like sex,
Mm-hmm.
and you do,
Mm-hmm.
then we have to start looking at, well, what does, you know, really what does that mean? And that's really where it starts to become a very therapeutic issue that we need to look at, you know,
Right.
the power behind it. what's the person who's saying, no sex,
Right.
discussions even, what are they protecting? What sits underneath that? So that's where it can become very nuanced. So I would encourage a gentle, very gentle level of inquiry, and possibly it would be a conversation that you would engage in with a professional, because there's more going on than just the sex.
Right.
Is my answer to that. Yeah.
I think that's very good advice.
Thank you, my dear wife.
Yeah. There were also a few questions about talking to one's partner about not centering the sex around orgasm, that really wanting more time spent and importance put on pleasure, foreplay, the arousal process, that some people take a little while to warm up. And how do you talk to your partner about that, and have it remain, not have it so that they're not getting defensive? Oh, am I doing something wrong, or what?
Yeah. I think that comes down to being able to get used to talking about sex before you start doing it. Because one of the things about talking about sex in the middle of sex is it can be a real kind of energy disruptor. And talking about sex in the middle of sex is important for ongoing consent and managing pain and stuff. So yes, take that as a given, absolutely. But in terms of the nuanced kind of existential element of it, talking about sex with your partner before you do it and having it as an ongoing conversation allows you to talk about it in such a way where the pressure is reduced. So talking about sex when you're nude, when you're turned on, when a bit of you is inside a bit of another person, potentially, that's pretty vulnerable. And then to try and have a really complicated conversation while you're nude, trying to be cool, and inside someone or someone's inside you is just really a lot.
But that's what I've been doing wrong.
So be nice to yourselves, people. Don't put yourself in a situation where that's going on. And we mitigate that by talking about it before and saying, what does sex mean to you? And one of the questions I always ask my clients is, why do you have sex? And then they're kind of like, what?
Yeah.
What WTF? What kind of question is that? Yeah. But it's an important question, because when we know what our intention is, so do I want to, and usually, when I say to people, why do you have sex? They never, well, not never, occasionally they say to have an orgasm, which is cool. But often they say, I want to feel pleasure. I want to feel connected. I want to feel sexy. I want to feel desired. I want to feel wanted. I want to feel, a bunch of different things. And the good news is that all that stuff doesn't require orgasms. All that stuff requires you keeping your eyes on the prize and sort of centering that. But what can happen during sex, in the middle of the activity, whatever your preferred activities are, what can happen is that if we lose sight of our intention, why we're there, we can then get caught up in, the mental kind of chatter, the shitty committee in your head that starts saying, well, this is taking too long. I haven't had an orgasm. I wonder if they're going to. I wonder if, why am I even here? Oh, look, I didn't, what, the ceiling needs painting, and then it's all over. Like, right. Because you're taken out of the moment. So this is the thing often with people who are struggling around sex in that way. They're thinking about everything else except what they're doing. Right. And accept why they're there. So this is a real grounding practice, is to have a conversation with any potential lovers about, why do you have sex? Why do you, what do you get out of it? How do you like to feel during sex? Yeah. And keeping that front of mind, keeping that at the top of your interaction. Yeah. And then that means there's going to be less emphasis on, who's coming, who's not coming. Do we have to get to whichever, apex activity that says, well, that's real sex, And
Especially,
why is a hands job not real sex? I mean, it should be. I think it's real sex, you know. But the folks make their own assumptions about that. Folks make their own assessment.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, I will often give the advice of, when you bring up, and this is another one, bring up about STI testing and were you tested? When was your last partner? All of that. I like to tell people to say, what do you want to feel tonight? Or what do you want to feel when we have sex?
Yeah.
And that can change. Like telling your partner, that can change. And in fact, it will change. But I want you to know, I'm really interested in knowing on how you want to feel during sex. And I'll tell you actually what I want to feel. I want to feel desired. And then you could even start that by saying, but I know it's hard. I say desired and it might mean something else to you than it does to me. And when I say desired, I mean, I want eye gazing. I want a lot of thoughtful touching. I want talking. I want compliments. I want this,
Yeah.
And for your other partner, it might be, I want your hands on my genitals all the time.
Exactly.
So, and that may not be the thing that you would ever think of that someone feels desired.
Yeah. And one of the other questions I think that can be helpful is, especially for people who are a little less verbal, because not everybody wants to be yabbada yabbada. And, with communication about pleasure, which is what our theme is today, talking is one thing, but also, listening is another thing, and we'll get onto that in a second, but also the nonverbal part, and so being able to communicate pleasure through touch and through body language. And so a helpful question can be, in the beginning, before you're actually getting amongst it, is how will I know when you're enjoying yourself? What does your body do when it's experiencing pleasure? And I think that that's really helpful, because then they can say, well, I think I close my eyes and, I put my tits out or whatever, but, and it also encourages the person to say, well, what does my body do when I'm experiencing pleasure?
Yeah.
And then there's communication with yourself, so there's so many layers to this.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that's very good information. Let me look at the other questions here, because we covered a few that I was going to ask about. Someone had asked about communicating to your partner ahead of time, how your mental health affects your libido. And I'm going to extend that to being able to talk to your partner in a vulnerable way about trauma, whether that's physical trauma or mental trauma or whatever, and how that affects intimacy.
Right.
The strategies of how to do that, because it's a very vulnerable place to be when you are talking about that. And some people think, well, being naked and fucking is vulnerable. It's like, well, you know what? Actually, revealing personal things about yourself, in my opinion, are way more vulnerable than that. At least is for me.
Yeah.
So how do you go about that in a way that feels safe, but is also a way to get your partner on the same page?
So I think, talking about trauma and mental health is, again, not a subject you discuss in the middle of sex necessarily. You can, as long as if you've flagged it prior. Part of the thing about talking about trauma and mental health, like sex, is the stigma that we don't want to disclose that these things are affecting us. But when you know that, depending on how the mental health thing shows up for you in sex, what effect does it have on you? So a sentence you could use is, I live with, depression, or I live with such and such, whatever you call your experience of mental health. I live with X. And when X is present, it affects my sex life by ABC. And it's just a simple statement. We need to start understanding that these are very complex things, but in terms of beginning to communicate them, the more simple we can make them, the less overwhelming it feels, you know. So I live with X and the effect on my sex life is ABC. And then having a partner coming to the listening part and going, so tell me more about what that means for you, or what effect does that have on you, is a crucial part of communication for the side of the listener to understand this is what it's like to step into the shoes of the other person. So this is the practice of empathy, understanding the experience of the other through their lens. So depending again on what the intention is for the person who's living with the, you know, the mental health issue, you know, do they just want to be validated and understood by their partner? Do they want to then segue into, and because of ABC, you know, I experience DEF. Is there some extra piece that you want the partner to know? Or is it just, I want you to know that there are some days, you know, and our friend Joellen Noddy has a whole book about this. That's called Sex and Depression.
Yeah, the monster under the bed, sex, depression, and the conversations we aren't having.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's a fantastic book. I encourage folks to go and get it. On my podcast, The Erotic Philosopher, I interviewed her a couple of weeks ago. And one of the gems that she shared, and she's really an expert on this, so I really encourage you to seek out Joellen Noddy. Jo, how do you spell it?
Joellen, and then Noddy is Notte.
Right. So check her out. And her book and my podcast, The Erotic Philosopher. And she talks about the duos where one or both people are living with mental health conditions and the effect on their sex life. What she noticed from her surveys was that the couples who didn't shy away from the complicated conversations but dug in together had the better outcomes in their sex lives than those who didn't. And so what she said she found in her research was that it was not the depression that harmed people's sex lives. It was the lack of willingness for both parties to talk about it that caused the conflict. And I thought that was incredibly useful information for people. So, you know, defaulting to her research around that, I think, is really crucial, whether you're living with trauma, whether you're living with depression, whether you're living with
chronic illness,
you know, any of these things, you know, the being able to just say it like it is such a healing practice.
Yes. And it's such a relief too. You feel lighter, literally lighter. And it puts you in a better mood.
Absolutely. And there's nothing sexier than feeling validated and understood.
Absolutely.
You know, when you just feel like, oh gosh, I can just kind of, you know, relax into this person. I can fall into this person. It can feel really nice. You know, it can just feel like this is a good connection for me. And, you know, being able to set up that context. And this is, again, very specific to folks living with mental health issues and chronic health issues in general. You know, that's a real life skill that I encourage people to devote some time into, simplifying things by making very basic I statements and allowing room for those stories to exist in the relationship and not shying away.
Yeah, you know, it is something I bring up in when I talk to people about body image and sex, is that sometimes the most freeing thing to do is to actually tell someone what you're feeling in the moment. So it's like, I know we're here, I know, you know, we're about to do this, but I have issues with my body and I don't like to have my stomach touched. But also just know that I'm going to be, if I seem a little distant, it's because I'm thinking about my body and I'm working on it. You know, just letting them know so that they're not in their heads going, why am I getting a weird vibe here? Or why do they keep pushing my hand away from their stomach? Or you know, there's so many things, and being able to name that in the room is really freeing, and something you don't have to hide through a very good experience.
And this affects people of all genders too. I mean, I know that, you know, people with penises who struggle with erection problems, which is, truthfully, 100% of penis owners are going to have erection problems at some stage through their life, not consistently, but it's very, very common. Same with, unwanted ejaculations, also very, very common, but we tend to not want to talk about that stuff. We just sort of, push it under the carpet. And, depending on our experience of life, our willingness to talk about these uncomfortable things, will determine the ease with which we can talk about it. So whether it's body image in terms of size, shape, illness, these kinds of things, or it's, performance anxiety and function, these are also things that make people feel terribly embarrassed and uncomfortable. And they're so normal, they're so common. And being able to talk about these over time is just such a crucial skill to develop, and such a crucial skill to invest in.
That I think is the key word for this session of our Friday sessions, is that it's an investment in your own sexuality. It's your investment in the sex you have with others, I think. Yeah. So we are done. That is our little talk for this Friday. Next Friday, we'll be here again at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. For those in the UK, and 7 a.m. on Saturday for our Australian friends.
That's right.
So keep looking at our Instagram, because we'll have another question coming up for your questions to get your feedback, and then we'll ask Cindy about her wisdom next week. Next week we will. All right.
We will.
For now, I'll see you later.
Bye, everybody. Bye.